Hey everyone, just a research stream before tomorrow's discussion. Just going to do like a quick overview of immigration insofar as I can do a quick overview tonight. But I've gone through this article here by Glenn Kessler and off air, gone through some of their sources and so and also looked up some other sources too that I think could be interesting to go through. Links are in the description. Call-ins are open, so yell at me in chat if you want to jump in and you're in the waiting room. The bipartisan border security deal that's headed for a pivotal first vote this week would pair $20 billion in emergency spending with policy changes that would amount to the most stringent immigration bill endorsed by a Democratic president in recent memory. President Joe Biden is calling the bill the toughest and fairest in decades, and progressives are calling it a return to the Trump era. The 370-page bill is already in jeopardy. This is from February 5th. With House Republican leaders vowing that they'll never vote on the long negotiated package, they are joined by conservative senators who are arguing that the 118 billion plus legislation, which also sends tens of billions in aid to Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, has too many loopholes to effectively stop spiking immigration at the southern border. Progressives in both chambers of Congress are also turned off by the deal, lamenting that it amounts to an embrace of Donald Trump style border policies and an undue shrinking of the asylum system designed to protect vulnerable immigrants. Yet Biden is throwing his weight behind the plan, which he called essential to making the US Mexico border, quote, more orderly, secure, fair, and humane, unquote. It would deliver far more emergency cash than his October request for less than 14 billion in border funding, as illegal border crossings from Mexico reached an all-time high in December with nearly 250,000 arrests. As members of both parties scrap over the substance of the bill, here's a rundown of what's really in it. Detention. Immigration and Customs Enforcement would also get 8 billion in emergency funding, rivaling the agency's regular annual budget of about 9 billion. The emergency funding would include more than 3 billion for increased detention capacity. The plan would set a goal of speeding up the review of asylum claims, striving to let no cases last more than 6 months, often by allowing asylum officers to close out a claim rather than going through immigration courts. U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services would get nearly 4 billion to help shoulder that new workload, including for hiring more than 4,300 asylum officers. The measure would require asylum seekers to show greater proof to seek refuge in the U.S. and would ensure they are allowed a lawyer if they are facing rapid deportation. All unaccompanied children under 14 years old would also be granted lawyers during removal proceedings, covered by an infusion of 350 million for the Department of Health and Human Services. Immigrant advocates quickly panned the proposal, with the ACLU arguing that it would, quote, eviscerate, unquote, long-standing protections, and the National Immigrant Justice Center stressing that it would make asylum largely unobtainable for those who are permitted to request it at ports of entry. The bill would force the Department of Homeland Security to shutter the border if daily illegal crossings top 5,000 migrants on average, or 8,500 in a single day. Unaccompanied minors from countries other than Mexico and Canada would not count towards that total. The administration could only reopen the border if encounters of illegal crossings dropped to 75% of the number that initially triggered the closure. DHS would also have the power to shut down the border if crossings average more than 4,000 per day for a week, and Biden has signaled he would aggressively use that authority. During a border shutdown, many people trying to cross the US Mexico border would be quickly deported, but exceptions would be made for unaccompanied minors and people who meet the requirements of the United Nations Convention Against Torture rules. Ports of entry. DHS would still consider asylum requests from people crossing at legal ports of entry during those periods of border shutdown, but just not in between those ports. Officials would have to process at least 1,400 asylum requests per day under those terms. Local support. 1.4 billion would be dispersed to help states and local governments handle the influx of immigrants. In New York alone, Governor Kathy Hochul earlier this month proposed spending 2.4 billion to provide services to migrants in her annual budget. Border wall. The bill would force the Biden administration to use funds already laid out for border barriers on the kind of steel fencing that Trump boasted during his tenure. That Ballard style wall is supposed to be 18 to 30 feet high with, quote, anti dig and, quote, anti climb features. Afghan nationals. Permanent residency would be offered to Afghans who fled their home country and received special immigrant visas following the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 2021. It would also allow Afghans who are considered U.S. allies to be deemed refugees and entitled to special State Department protections or immediate removal from Afghanistan. Special immigrant status would also be offered to Afghans who are an immediate relative of a U.S. military member or veteran. Up to 2,500 special immigrant visas will be offered for a year for up to a total of 10,000. Offered a year for a total of 10,000. Countering fentanyl. Or actually, hang on, let's skip this. Visas. The deal would free up 250,000 new visas over half a decade for people seeking to work in the U.S. or to join family members. It would offer work authorization to the children and spouses of people who have H-1B visas for specialized jobs that often require a bachelor's degree, like tech and engineering work. Immigrants awaiting visas would would also be eligible for work if they have a U.S. citizen spouse or fiance, or if their parent is a U.S. citizen, or parent is the spouse or fiance of a U.S. citizen. Countering fentanyl. Folded into the border security deal is legislation aimed at beefing up anti-money laundering policies and sanctions known as the Fend Off Fentanyl Act. The Drug Enforcement Agency would receive more than 23 million to disrupt and disband Mexican cartels trafficking fentanyl across the southern border, and the State Department and USAID would see about 25 million for programs aimed at curbing the flow of the drugs into the U.S. Documented dreamers. Advocates and some Democrats quickly slammed the lack of relief or pathways to citizenship for so-called dreamers or undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children. There are also no new citizenship path for farm workers or other long-time residents who also work in essential jobs. The legislation does, however, aim to provide a pathway to citizenship for documented dreamers or children who accompany their parents on a work visa and who could potentially lose their place in line for a green card at age 21. And so we give credit, Jennifer Schultz and Caitlin Emma from Politico. Work permits. Immigrants who apply for asylum could be eligible to work in the U.S. while they wait. Border Patrol, Custom and Border Protection would get nearly 7 billion in emergency funding, a massive infusion above its current yearly budget of around 21 billion. That extra funding would include 723 million, would cover increased hiring of Border Patrol agents and overtime pay. The bill would also give DHS more flexibility in hiring Border Patrol agents and create yearly training requirements for non-lethal force, protecting due process, and preserving civil and human rights. Anthony Adragna contributed to this report. Okay. I don't know if this is going to be especially interesting to go over, but Computational analysis of 140 years of U.S. political speeches revealed more positive but increasingly polarized framings of immigration. Significance. And this is by Serena Chang, Dallas Card, Chris Becker, Julia Mendelson, Rob Voigt, Leah Bustan, Ran Abramitsky, and Dan Jurafsky. Edited by Joseph Ferry, Northwestern University. Okay. Significance. In the first comprehensive quantitative analysis over the past 140 years of U.S. congressional and presidential speech about immigration, we identify a dramatic rise in pro-immigration attitudes beginning in the 1940s, followed by a steady decline among Republicans relative to Democrats over the past 50 years. We also reveal divergent usage of positive, i.e. families, and negative, i.e. crime, framings over time by party and between frequently mentioned European and non-European groups. Finally, to capture more suggestive language, we introduce a method for measuring implicit dehumanizing metaphors long associated with immigration, animals, cargo, etc., and show that such metaphorical language has been significantly more common in speeches by Republicans than Democrats in recent decades. We classify and analyze 200,000 U.S. congressional speeches and 5,000 presidential communications related to immigration from 1880 to the present. Despite the salience of anti-immigration rhetoric today, we find that political speech about immigration is now much more positive on average than in the past, with the shift largely taking place between World War II and the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. However, since the late 1970s, political parties have become increasingly polarized in their attitude in their expressed attitudes towards immigration, such that Republican speeches today are as negative as the average congressional speech was in the 1920s, an era of strict immigration quotas. Using an approach based on contextual embeddings of text, we find that modern Republicans are significantly more likely to use language that is suggestive of metaphors long associated with immigration, such as animals and cargo, and make greater use of frames like crime and legality. The tone of speeches also differs strongly based on which nationalities are mentioned, with a striking similarity between how Mexican immigrants are framed today and how Chinese immigrants were framed during the era of Chinese exclusion in the late 19th century. Overall, despite more favorable attitudes toward immigrants and formal elimination of race-based restrictions, nationality is still a major factor in how immigrants are spoken of in Congress. Immigration is one of the most important and divisive topics in American public life. From the rise of vocal anti-immigrant politicians in recent years, it is tempting to conclude that these attitudes towards immigration are more negative or at least more polarized than ever before. However, resistance to newcomers has always been a central part of our public discourse about immigration, from anti-Chinese fear-mongering in the 1880s to concerns about Southern and Eastern European immigrants in the 1920s to the anti-immigration rhetoric of Trump administration in 2017 to 2020, uh, claims that certain types of immigrants can never truly join American society have been a perennial part of our discourse. For example, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, architect of anti-immigrant legislation, declared a century ago, immigration is bringing to the country people whom it is very difficult to assimilate because immigrants are from, quote, races most alien to the body of the American people, unquote. We seek to move beyond individual anecdotes to ask, how have attitudes towards immigrants in the United States changed over the past century? How does recent political debate over immigration compare to the long sweep of U.S. history? This question is a challenge because the public opinion polls that ask about attitudes towards immigration only began in the 1960s and were only asked about immigration sporadically until recent years. We instead turn to the congressional record and other sources of political speech using quantitative text analysis methods to systematically investigate the language used in congressional and presidential speeches about immigration over the last 140 years. Our paper considers a full corpus of more than 17 million congressional speeches from 1880 to the present, of which we identified 200,000 speeches, roughly, relevant to the topic of immigration. We also incorporate presidential communications from the same time period, making this a comprehensive quantitative analysis of American political speech about immigration at the federal level, covering the entire time period from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to the present day. Numerous, numerous studies have analyzed the political history of U.S. immigration using qualitative approaches and historical archives. Quantitative work on immigration has also used data such as migration and census records. Rhetorical aspects of immigration debates have been studied qualitatively, especially the use of dehumanizing language and metaphors such as vermin and cargo. But these authors have not rigorously quantified how common such language is over time. Last, other scholars have applied computational methods from natural language processing to study coverage of immigration in news media, and Congress. But none have used these tools to investigate such a long time span or comprehensive corpus of speeches about U.S. immigration with a consistent methodology. Our analysis is based on a combination of methods to identify relevant speeches along with a corresponding tone, pro-immigration, anti-immigration, or neutral. We make use of automated text classification based on extensive human annotations. Using a semi-automatic automated process, we also curate and apply a set of lexicons for analyzing relevant frames, i.e., ways of characterizing immigrants and immigration. Finally, to quantify implicit dehumanizing metaphors in speeches, we develop an approach based on using neural contextual embedding models to measure if references to immigrants are suggestive of various metaphorical categories, materials, and methods. We find that political speeches about immigration today are far more likely to be positive than in the past, with the shift from negative to positive mostly taking place between World War II and the passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, and being net positive on average in nearly all sessions of Congress since the early 1950s. Extending this analysis to presidential communications, we find President Trump to be a stark exception as the first president in modern American history to express sentiment toward immigration that is more negative than the average member of his own party. As with many political issues, the two parties have become increasingly polarized over time, and we find a linear increase in polarization in immigration. Beginning in the late 1970s under President Carter, today Democrats are unprecedentedly positive about immigration, whereas Republicans are as negative as the average legislator was in the 1920s during the push for strict immigration quotas. This divergence is clearly part of a broader trend toward polarization on many issues. For immigration specifically, our analysis reveals the beginnings of this predating the rise in generic political polarization observed in Ginskow et al. By more than a decade. Along with the polarization by party, nationality of immigrants continues to matter greatly, with speeches mentioning Mexican immigration being consistently more negative than the average, dramatically so in comparison to European groups. Moreover, there is a striking similarity between how Mexican immigrants are framed today and how Chinese immigrants were framed during the period of Chinese exclusion in the 19th century, more negative in tone, greater explicit emphasis on frames such as crime, labor, legality, and significantly greater use of implicit dehumanizing metaphors in comparison to European groups. Thus, while far more members of Congress today express favorable attitudes toward immigration than in the past, there remains a strong and growing strain of anti-immigration speech, especially among Republicans, along with perennial references to threats, legality, and crime. Despite the elimination of country-specific immigration quotas in the 1960s, expressed opinions toward immigrants still vary greatly by country of origin, and enduring rhetorical strategies continue to be developed against more marginalized groups. results. We'll get to this in a second here. Tone of immigration speeches, starting with the complete record of 17 million congressional speeches from 1880 to 2020. We collected human annotations and trained machine learning classifiers to identify speeches relevant to immigration, along with an accompanying tone, pro-immigration, anti-immigration, or neutral. Both panels of Figure 1 show the average tone, percent pro-immigrant minus percent anti-immigrant, expressed in congressional speeches over this time period, black line. The trend for congressional speeches by Democrats and Republicans are shown in Figure 1. Top a comparable time series for presidents is shown in Figure 1 bottom. By applying the same models to all presidential communications collected by the American Presidency Project for alternative models, validity checks, and variation within parties, reference SI appendix. All right, so 1880 to present. We begin by documenting a number of findings about political speech related to immigration. First, average sentiment toward immigration in Congress and the executive branch is negative throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, from the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act 1882 through the advent of strict immigration quotas in the 1920s. The pervasiveness of negative sentiment can help make sense of the political context that gave rise to a suite of increasingly restrictive immigration regulations. It is particularly noteworthy that we do not find a rise in negative speeches leading up to the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. Rather, we find that political sentiment in Congress was staunchly anti-immigration for more than 4 decades, which is consistent with the political history that has recounted the many congressional attempts to pass anti-immigration legislation, all of which were struck down by the president in the years before successful passage of quotas. Second, attitudes towards immigration became more positive around the start of World War II, rising steadily from the 1940s until the end of the Johnson administration. The average tone in Congress has essentially been pro-immigration since the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, consistent with efforts by post-war presidents to reframe the public understanding of immigration as a positive for the country. Third, beginning about a decade after the reopening of the border with the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, there has been growing partisan divide, larger year-to-year variations, and an overall decline in sentiment toward immigration among Republicans. Democrats, by contrast, have grown more positive about immigration over time, especially under Presidents Obama and Trump, with the exception of a temporary bipartisan drop in pro-immigration speeches in the early 1990s, coinciding with the end of the Cold War and the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement. By contrast, Republican legislators are now approximately as overtly anti-immigration in their speeches as the average legislator was. Okay, so we've gone through this. Um, Although the difference in tone between the parties today is larger than at any point in the past, tone also varies dramatically depending on which groups of immigrants are being discussed. Figure 2 shows the average tone when considering only those speeches that mention each of the three most commonly mentioned nationalities in immigration speeches: Mexicans, Chinese, and Italian. Speeches mentioning Chinese immigrants were overwhelmingly negative during the period of Chinese exclusion, 1882 to 1943, while the tone toward Italian immigrants was slightly more favorable, yet still negative at the time. Attitudes towards all groups improved from 1940 to 1970, with mentions of Chinese and Mexican immigrants remaining relatively more negative overall. Mentions of Italian immigrants are overwhelmingly positive today, but since the late 1970s, the gap in tone between speeches mentioning Mexican as opposed to Italian immigrants has remained approximately as large as the gap in tone that exists between Republicans and Democrats today. Although a few countries are mentioned as frequently as these three, this pattern is mirrored in broader regional trends. Most European countries are referred to positively on average by the 1960s, Asian countries by the 1980s, countries Caribbean countries remaining negative on average until the 2000s. Language framing and dehumanization. To better understand the language that is suggestive of pro-immigration or anti-immigration tone in the full corpus of immigration speeches, we train interpretable logistic regression models to approximate the predictions of our contextual embedding models and to determine feature importance using shapely values. Shapely values. The shapely value is a solution concept used in game theory that involves fairly distributing both gains and costs to several actors working in a coalition. Game theory is when two or more players or factors are involved in a strategy to achieve a desired outcome or payoff. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to access this. I'm still not sure I understand the shape. I don't understand it's game theory, but I'm not sure I understand. I guess we'll just read Wikipedia real quick and then it's what they cite. could probably just find it by him, since I really don't like to use Wikipedia as a source for anything. Shapley's chief contribution to game theory was the Shapley value, which he devised in 1953. In a cooperative game, that is one in which players communicate and, most important, make binding agreements, in which the payoff must be distributed among players who have made unequal contributions, the Shapley value determines the fairest distribution for payoffs. For example, the Shapley value can be used to determine what each member of a group should pay in a restaurant when everyone shares their food. A key part of Shapley's Nobel winning work was the deferred acceptance or Gale-Shapley algorithm, which he devised with American mathematician and economist David Gale to solve matching problems where, for instance, an equal number of men and women actively seeking suitable mates can be paired off until a stable arrangement has been reached where no pair of mates would prefer another match. Roth and others later applied the Gale-Shapley algorithm to such diverse problems as matching new doctors with hospitals and prospective students with high schools. In 1974, Shapley and American economist Herbert Scarf used Gale's top trading cycles algorithm to prove that stable allocations are also possible in one-sided markets in which decisions are made by only one party in the transaction. The Shapley-Scarf model has been implemented in quickly and efficiently matching patients in need of an organ transplant with biologically compatible donors. Most influential words for pro-immigration and anti-immigration speeches in 3 time periods when approximating the predicted tone from our classification models with simpler logistic regression models. Chinese, undesirable, exclusion, violation. Okay. Interestingly, despite the relatively negative tone associated with Mexican immigrants in the modern period, compared to other groups, we do find strong positive associations with the terms Hispanic and Latino, which refer to much broader communities. Part of the reason is likely that these terms are much more commonly used by Democrats than Republicans, dramatically so in the case of Latino, and hence are indicators of Democratic speeches which are more likely to be pro-immigration. Importantly, however, references to Mexico and Mexican are still more frequent in our corpus and indeed are mentioned with very similar frequency by Democrat and Republicans in the context of immigration. Meaning the observed tone difference by group is not simply a matter of Mexico primarily being mentioned by Republicans. Relative usage for each of 14 frames by Republicans compared to Democrats, both for the late 19th and early 20th century left and the past 2 decades right. Farther to the left on each plot represents more frequent usage by Democrats and vice versa. Circle represents the overall prominence of the frame in speeches about immigration relative to all speeches. To ensure the robustness in these findings, we leave out each word in turn, in turn from each frame and show the full range of possible values obtained using horizontal lines. Democrats, by contrast, are more likely to emphasize the positive frames, family, victims, contributions, culture, which is reflected in terms in our lexicon such as hardworking, worthy, parents, children, integrating, diverse, and contributing. Though some terms may carry more weight than others in these measures, many terms contribute to each frame, and these patterns are robust to the exclusion of any individual term, as well as to automated lexicon expansions. I'm not sure there's anything else in here I want to necessarily go over today. I wonder if I contact the authors, they'll come on. Go over go over this on stream sometime maybe. Fiscal year 2021, Southwest Border Enforcement Report. Office of Immigration Statistics, Mark R. Rosenblum, Irene Gibson, and Sean Leung. Summary: U.S. Customs and Border Protection faced an unprecedented set of challenges at the border in fiscal year 2021, grappling with the continued COVID-19 pandemic that deeply affected the health and well-being of its workforce, even as it reported the highest number of Southwest border encounters in 20 years. The high number of total encounters was partly driven by high recidivism rates among individuals processed under Title 42, public health authorities, meaning how, wait, this is 2021. Oof. Do we have anything more recent? Well, probably not 2024, but we might have 2023 data. Based. U.S. Customs and Border Protection is the, yeah, okay. Total CBP enforcement actions, total encounters, fiscal year 2017, 216,000, 281, 288, 241, 294, 551, 1,137,452. That's the total encounters altogether. So 500,000, 700,000. We'll just round to the closest. 1,150,000, 600,000, 2 million, 2,803,000. 3,200,000. Do they not do like a full, like a detailed breakdown though, like they did in the 2021 one? So this is fentanyl seizures. We don't necessarily know. Do we have better stats? Law-abiding immigrants, the incarceration gap between immigrants and U.S. born 1870 to 2020. Oh my God. I might not go through this. I'll just see what the abstract says first. See if we want to. By Ran Abramitsky, Leah Bustan, Eliza Jacome, Santiago Perez, and Juan David Torres. We provide the first nationally representative long-run series, 1870 to 2020, of incarceration rates for immigrants in the U.S. born. As a group, immigrants have lower incarceration rates than the U.S. born for 150 years. Moreover, relative to the U.S. born immigrants, incarceration rates have declined since 1960. Immigrants today are 60% less likely to be incarcerated, 30% relative to U.S. born whites. This relative decline occurred among immigrants from all regions and cannot be explained by changes in immigrants' observable characteristics or immigration policy. Instead, the decline is part of a broader divergence in outcomes between less educated immigrants and U.S. born counterparts. Also, I did look at that last stat, so we'll do. I will link this if anyone wanted to see it. And I didn't go over the 2021 one, so I'll take that out. The tendency to associate immigration and crime has been pervasive throughout U.S. history. For example, in 1891, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge advocating closing the border, warning that Italian immigrants were members of the mafia, a secret society using murder as a means of maintaining discipline. Indeed, over 150 years. Wait, is this that same paper? Or oh, they're referencing it. Okay. Because this is more recent. This is 2024. This just came out. Whereas the other one came out 4 years ago, or was done 4 years ago at least. Indeed, over the past 150 years, congressional speeches about immigration are twice as likely to mention the words relating to crime per speech than were speeches on other topics. Contrary to this anti-immigration rhetoric, we document that as a group, immigrant men have had a lower incarceration rate than U.S. born men, for the last 150 years of American history. We combine newly assembled full count census data 1870 to 1940 with census/ACS samples 1950 to 2020 to construct the first nationally representative series of incarceration rates for immigrants and U.S. born between 1870 and present day. From 1870 to 1950, immigrants' incarceration rate was only slightly lower than that of U.S. born men. However, starting in 1960, immigrants have become significantly less likely to be incarcerated than the U.S. born, even though as a group, immigrants are a, now are relatively younger, more likely to be non-white, have lower incomes, and are less educated. Characteristics often associated with involvement in the criminal justice system. Today, immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than all U.S. born men and 30% less likely to be incarcerated than relative to U.S. born white men. The similar incarceration rates between immigrants and U.S. born in the past and the lower incarceration rates of immigrants today are broadly consistent with prior studies documenting immigrant U.S. born incarceration gaps for specific states and time periods. Moeling and Peel. And Butcher and Peel. With access to large samples, including the full population census before 1950, we are also able to provide the first investigation of incarceration rates by country of origin, spanning 1870 to 2020. We find a substantial decline in incarceration rates relative to the U.S. born among immigrants from all major sending regions. European immigrants historically had slightly lower incarceration rates to U.S. born men, but recently experienced far lower incarceration rates. Chinese immigrants had similar incarceration rates to the U.S. born before 1960, but today have significantly lower incarceration rates. Mexican and Central American immigrants had particularly high incarceration rates in the past, but have had lower incarceration rates than U.S. born since 1960. From 2005 on, Mexican and Central American immigrants have been more likely to be incarcerated than white U.S. born men, although we note that a large portion of the increase in Mexican and Central American incarceration after 2005 is driven by detentions in federal immigration facilities, often for immigration-related offenses. When we drop areas home to the largest immigration and customs enforcement facilities, the gap relative to U.S. born white men moderates or disappears in most years. Although, is that because they're counting immigration as a crime, I guess, and that's why they're categorizing it that way? Or is it that they're categorizing it that way because they're committing crime in the facility? So I think the way I'm reading it though is the former, though, not the latter. That because they're being detained in the facilities, they're counting towards the population in that census, or in that sense, I guess, and maybe the census too, but in that sense. Although our data do not enable us to precisely pinpoint why there has been a sharp relative decline in the immigrant incarceration rate since 1960, we are able to rule out three ex ante plausible explanations. First, the relative decline in immigrant incarceration is not driven by rising rates of incarceration of U.S. born black Americans. The decline is also apparent when comparing immigrants to U.S. born white men only. Second, the decline is not driven by changes in immigrants' observable characteristics, namely their country of origin, age, race, marital status, state of residence, or educational attainment. If anything, immigrants' lower educational attainment in recent decades would predict that they should have higher incarceration rates than they do. Third, the relative decline is not mechanically driven by immigrant offenders being more likely to be deported in recent years, and thus not being present in the incarceration data. The relative decline in incarceration is present even among immigrants who are U.S. citizens and thus cannot be deported. Moreover, the timing of the decline is also inconsistent with this explanation. Whereas the relative decline in immigrant incarceration emerges in the 1960s, the sharp rise in deportations took place around 2000. We conclude the paper by showing that lower educated immigrants and U.S. born men, the group that accounts for the vast majority of incarcerated individuals, not only diverged in their incarceration propensities in recent decades, but also diverged at a similar moment along other dimensions, including their labor force participation and likelihood of marriage. One potential explanation for this broad pattern of divergence is that less educated immigrants might have remained relatively shielded from structural changes in the economy, such as globalization and skill based technological change, that negatively affected less educated US born men in recent decades. Immigrants are concentrated on manual tasks and service occupations rather than routine occupations, which did not experience large wage or employment declines in recent decades. Furthermore, immigrants may be more resilient to shocks given that they are a self selected group of individuals possessing traits such as a greater willingness to move long distances, less risk aversion, higher adaptability and cognitive ability, and higher levels of entrepreneurship. Related literature. Our work is most closely related to the set of papers that document immigrants' U.S. born incarceration gaps for specific states and time periods, summarized in Figure A1, studies historical flows into prisons using state prison records from 1904, 1910, 1923, 1930. Man, do we want to go through this? It, well, oh boy. Let's go through some of their graphs at least. Incarceration rates of immigrants and U.S. born men. All immigrants, old Europeans, new Europeans, Chinese. Okay. Differences in incarceration rates of immigrant and U.S. born men, adjusting for individual level characteristics, 1870 to 2019. So we're looking for the gap to be lower, right? That would be good. Or well, I mean, it would not be. It would be that would indicate a lower crime rate, right? Relative. So they track pretty closely. It looks like. Well, not necessarily. Um, well, many years it does track closely, but citizens have citizen immigrants commit crime at even lower rates, which I guess isn't like super shocking since they've obviously bought into the system clearly and have chosen to become part of the society. Okay, so I think this I might get in touch with these authors too, and I want to start doing that. I want to start like interviewing. I think it's important that science people, people who are engaged in actually engaging in studies and research, I think they should be more communicative with the public. I think it's good, and a lot of them are starting to do that. Like we're seeing with like Chris Ferguson, who I've interviewed, and others. I think that it's a step in the right direction. Hopefully, more follow in their footsteps. Okay, fiscal year 2023. Here we go. ICE annual report, December 29, 2023. Oh boy. Let's go through the executive summary here real quick. The U.S. ICE fiscal year 2023 annual report provides an overview of the agency's key programs, enforcement metrics, and accomplishments. It represents the agency's commitment to transparency and accountability and meets and exceeds the requirements in the joint explanatory statement accompanying the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act 2023, which states ICE is directed to continue issuing annual fiscal year ERO and HSI reports by not later than 90 days after the end of the fiscal year. The report should compare data for the reporting fiscal year to the prior five fiscal years in sortable, downloadable, printable, and format with a description of any significant deviations in data representation when compared to prior years. So is this only for enforcement and removal operations? Oh no, it's for all of it. Okay. I guess that's like their main thing though. Staffing, caseload versus staffing. ERO primarily focuses on immigration related law enforcement within the interior of the United States. However, during the past several years, ICE has detailed significant numbers VR personnel and support DHS efforts to manage irregular migration at the southwest border, including case processing and ground and air transportation for non-citizens who are initially apprehended by ICBP. In fiscal year 2023, ERO deployed more than 1,300 employees to support these efforts, accounting for approximately 17% of its workforce. As a result, ERO has had to carefully rebalance resources that were previously devoted to its interior immigration enforcement mission. Over so this is from 2018 to 2023. Oh, okay, 2023 specifically. While ERO primarily conducts administrative arrests for violations of U.S. immigration law, it also has the authority to make criminal arrests and initiate prosecution cases for immigration-related offenses, primarily under Title 8, but also under Title 18 of the U.S. Code. Using this authority, ERO criminal prosecution teams within the Directorate's 25 field offices work with officers of the U.S. attorneys to pursue violations of U.S. criminal code that come to light during enforcement actions. Non-citizens are convicted, generally complete their criminal sentences. Non-citizens subsequently, when the non-citizens are subsequently taken into ICE custody for administrative immigration violations and placed into removal proceedings after completing their criminal sentences. A decline? Immigration detainers. ERO lodges immigration detainers against certain non-citizens who have been arrested for criminal activity and taken into custody by state or local law enforcement agencies. A detainer is a request from ICE to state or local law enforcement agencies to one, notify ICE as early as possible before a removable non-citizen is released from their custody, and two, for the state or local law enforcement agencies to maintain custody of the non-citizen for a period of time not to exceed 48 hours beyond the time the individual would otherwise be released. This would allow EROs to assume custody for removal purposes in accordance with federal law. So I guess like if it was a sanctuary city, they wouldn't comply with that, or they would only in some cases. I should probably read through like the Border Patrol's like annual report too. Is there anything else in here I need to really look at? Center Square. I'm actually not familiar with this website, so yeah, I thought I was more conservative. That's why, being a more conservative source, I wanted to look through it. But illegal border crossers has since 2021 total more than individual population of 38 states. This might be fake news, so just keep this in mind. We'll go through it, but I'll see what they cite. An interview with the Center Square former acting commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection Mark Morgan, who was also chief of U.S. Border Patrol, delved into the numbers. The issue I run into all the time is people only count Border Patrol apprehensions or Southwest border encounters only, he told Center Square. Both fail to provide comprehensive encounters, especially by CBP, especially when these numbers don't account for the law, the unlawful use of CBP one app and parole policies being implemented by the Biden administration. He said all ports of entry, not just Southwest border land ports of entry, are being used to facilitate encounters. So he is Mark Morgan, former commissioner for U.S. Customs and Border Patrol from 2019 to 2021. Okay, so basically Trump's in the well, not the most recent one, right? But yeah, okay, the most recent aside from uh, Troy Miller. According to the data available, CBP data, national apprehension/encounters, include those reported at all air, sea, and land ports of entry, with CBP's fiscal year beginning October 1st as of June 7. Total nationwide encounters for fiscal year 2021 was 1,684. From January when Biden took office to September 2021, 2,700,666 in fiscal year 2022, and 2,096,000 in fiscal year 2023 through May. In the first 28 months of the Biden administration, total encounters nationwide are at least 6,547,000. However, this total excludes got-away data, which the CBP doesn't publicly report. Border Patrol and CBP, Office of Field Operation agents, tally gotaways in their respective internal tracking systems, but the data is not released to the public. Gotaways is the term they use to describe foreign nationals who illegally enter the U.S., who don't make asylum or other immigration claims, and intentionally seek to evade capture by federal, state, and local authorities. While agents would normally attempt to track and apprehend them and report their findings, they've been largely prevented from doing so because they've been pulled off their border security duties to process illegal foreign nationals and release them into the U.S. according to new Biden administration policies, agents have told the Center Square. There are at least 1,444,000 known gotaways reported by the Border Patrol and CBP field offices. Fiscal year 2021, there were at least 308,000 known reported gotaways. Presumably, this is like all public data, so we could probably go through. Well, oh, Jim Jordan. Probably isn't worth looking at. New data reveal worsening magnitude of the Biden border crisis and lack of interior immigration enforcement. I don't think this is going to be worth going through. Jim Jordan is such an unreputable figure. So unless there's a specific reason to, I probably won't go through that. If there's a more reputable source going through it. Should be able to access this directly. Comparing crime rates between undocumented immigrants and legal immigrants and native-born U.S. citizens. Despite its centrality to public and political discourse, we lack even basic information on fundamental questions regarding undocumented immigrants and crime. Oh, more of this, okay. This stems largely from data constraints. Going beyond existing research, we utilize data from the Texas Department of Public Safety, which checks and records immigration status of all arrestees throughout the state, contrary to public perception. We observe considerably lower felony arrest rates among undocumented immigrants compared to legal immigrants and native born U.S. citizens, and find no evidence that undocumented criminality has increased in recent years. Our findings help us understand why the most aggressive immigrant removal programs have not delivered on their crime reduction promises and are unlikely to do so in the future. Michael T. Light, Jingying He, Jason Roby, Douglas S. Massey edited, Princeton University. So basically, just, probably won't go through this tonight. Yeah, basically all of the data is going to probably show this. Unless anyone's got a study you want to send me, or meta-analysis that seems to indicate something else. About 5 million undocumented immigrants were residing in the United States in October 1996, with a range of about 4.6 to 5.4 million. The population was estimated to be growing. How old is this? Some of this stuff I didn't really look at before. I just kind of gathered some of it up on my phone and just looked around and said, I guess I'll check out some of these sources. Pew Research, what we know about unauthorized immigrants living in the United States. By Jeffrey Passel and Jens Manuel Krogstad. The unauthorized immigrant population in the United States reached 10.5 million in 2021, according to a new Pew Research Center estimates. That was a modest increase over 2019, but nearly identical to 2017. The number of unauthorized immigrants living in the United States in 2021 remained below its peak of 12.2 million in 2007. It was about the same size as in 2004 and lower every year from 2005 to 2015. The new estimates do not reflect changes that have occurred since apprehensions and expulsions of migrants along the U.S.-Mexico border started to increase in March of 2021. Migrating counters at the border have since reached historic heights. Okay. How we did this. Pew Research Center undertook this research to understand ongoing changes in the size and characteristics of the unauthorized immigrant population in the United States. The center has published estimates of U.S. unauthorized immigrant population for more than 2 decades. The estimates presented in this research are the center's latest, adding new and updated annual estimates for 2017 through 2021. Center estimates of the unauthorized immigrant population use a residual method. It is similar to methods used by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Office of Immigration Statistics and non-governmental organizations, including the Center for Migration Studies and Migration Policy Institute. These organizations' estimates are generally consistent with ours. Our estimates are also aligned with official U.S. data sources, including birth records, school enrollment figures, and tax data, as well as Mexican census and surveys. Our residual methods for estimating the nation's unauthorized immigrant population includes these steps. Estimates the total number of immigrants living in the country in a particular year using data from U.S. Census and government surveys such as the American Community Survey and Current Population Survey. Estimates estimate the number of immigrants living in the U.S. legally using official counts of immigrant and refugee admissions together with other demographic data, for example, death and out-migration rates. Subtract our estimates of lawful immigrants from our estimate of the total immigrant population and provide an initial estimate of the unauthorized immigration population. Our final estimate of the U.S. unauthorized immigrant population, as well as estimates for lawful immigrants, includes an upward adjustment. We do this because censuses and surveys tend to miss some people. Undercounts for immigration, especially unauthorized immigrants, tend to be higher than for other groups. Our 1990 estimate comes from work by Robert Warren and John Robert Warren. The term unauthorized immigrant reflects standard and customary usage by many academic researchers and policy analysts. The Department of Homeland Security's Office of Immigration Statistics also generally uses it. The term means the same thing as undocumented immigrants, and illegal aliens. All right, number of unauthorized immigrants in the United States remained mostly stable from 2017 to 2021. Here are the key findings about how U.S. unauthorized immigrant population changed from 2017 to 2021. The most common country of birth for unauthorized immigrants was Mexico. However, the population of unauthorized immigrants from Mexico dropped by 900,000 from 2017 to 2021 to just 4.1 million. There were increases in unauthorized immigrants from nearly every other region in the world: Central America, the Caribbean, South America, Asia, Europe, and Sub Saharan Africa. Among U.S. states, only Florida and Washington saw increases to their unauthorized immigrant populations, while California and Nevada saw decreases. In all other states, unauthorized immigrant populations were unchanged. 4.6% of workers in 2021 were unauthorized immigrants, virtually identical to their share in 2017. The U.S. foreign-born population was 14.1% of the population in 2021. That was very slightly higher than the last 5 years, but below the record high of 14.8 in 1890. As of 2021, the nation's 10.5 million unauthorized immigrants represented about 3% of the U.S. population and 22% of the foreign-born population. These shares were among the lowest since the 1990s. Between 2007 and 2021, the unauthorized immigrant population decreased by 1.75 million, or 14%. Meanwhile, the lawful immigrant population grew by more than 8 million, a 29% increase, and the number of naturalized U.S. citizens grew by 49%. In 2021, naturalized citizens accounted for nearly half of all immigrants in the country. Where unauthorized immigrants come from. Unauthorized immigrants living in the United States come from many parts of the world, with Mexico being the most common country of origin. The origin countries for unauthorized immigrants have changed since the population peaked in 2007, before the Great Recession slowed immigration. Here are some highlights of those changes. Mexicans no longer a majority of unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. Mexico. The number of unauthorized immigrants from Mexico living in the United States, 4.1 million in 2021, was the lowest since the 1990s. Mexico accounted for 39% of the nation's unauthorized immigrants in 2021, by far the smallest share on record. The decrease in unauthorized immigrants from Mexico reflects several factors: a broader decline in migration from Mexico to the U.S., Mexican immigrants to the U.S. continuing to return to Mexico expanded opportunities for lawful immigration from Mexico and other countries, especially for temporary and agricultural workers. They don't cite that Mexico is like technically a developed country now. I wonder how the improving economic situation in Mexico and development also may play a role. I wonder. The rest of the world, the total number of unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. from countries other than Mexico has grown rapidly. In 2021, this population was 6.4 million, up by 900,000 from 2017. Almost every region in the world had a noticeable increase in the number of unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. Almost every region in the world had a notable increase in the number of unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. from 2007 to 2021. The largest increases were from Central America and South and East Asia. After Mexico, the countries of origin with the largest unauthorized immigrant populations in the U.S. were El Salvador, India, Guatemala, and Honduras. India, Guatemala, and Honduras also increases from 2017. Three Central American countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, together represent 2.0 million unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. in 2021, or almost 20% of the total. The unauthorized immigrant population from the Northern Triangle grew by about 250,000 from 2017 to and about 700,000 in 2007. Venezuela was the country of birth for 190,000 U.S. unauthorized immigrants. In 2021, this population saw particularly fast growth from 130,000 in 2017 to 55,000 in 2007. Among countries with the largest numbers of U.S. unauthorized immigrants are India, Brazil, Canada, and the former Soviet Union countries. All experienced growth from 2017 to 2021. Some origin countries with significant unauthorized immigrant populations show no change, noticeably China, 375,000, and the Dominican Republic, 230,000. U.S. states of residence of unauthorized immigrants. The unauthorized immigrant population in most U.S. states stayed steady from 2017 to 2021. However, four states saw significant changes. Florida plus 80,000, Washington plus 60,000, California minus 150,000, Nevada negative 205,000. States with the most unauthorized immigrants: California 1.9, Texas 1.6, Florida 900,000, New York 600,000, New Jersey 450,000, Illinois 400,000. These states have consistently had the most unauthorized immigrants since 1990 and earlier. At the same time, the unauthorized immigrant population has become less geographically concentrated. In 2021, these six states were home to 56% of the nation's unauthorized immigrants, down from 80% in 1990. Unauthorized immigrants in the labor force. The share of unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. workforce was slightly less than 5% in 2021, compared to 3% of the U.S. total population. Demographics help explain the difference in difference. The unauthorized immigrant population includes relatively few children and elderly adults, groups that tend not to be in the labor force. Overall, about 7.8 million unauthorized immigrants were in the U.S. labor force in 2021. That was up slightly from 2019, but smaller than every year from 2007 to 2015. Here are some additional findings, but unauthorized immigrants as a share of the workforce nationwide and in certain states. Since 2003, unauthorized immigrants have made up 4.4% to 5.4% of all U.S. workers, a relatively narrow range. Fewer than 1% of workers in Maine, Montana, Vermont, and West Virginia in 2021 were unauthorized immigrants. Nevada, 9%, and Texas, 8%, had the highest shares of unauthorized immigrants in the workforce. All right, that's Pew Research, Jeffrey Passel, and Jens Manuel Krogstad. That should be enough research for this tonight on immigration. But hopefully it wasn't too boring. Thanks for watching, everybody. And, take care.